This is episode 19 of That Time I Got Reincarnated in the Same World as an Anime Podcaster, where we talk about anime, manga, isekai, and all the meta in between. I'm your host, Isekai Sensei-Sama, aka Brad. I'm joined in this weeb cabal by Bento Baggins, aka Ben.
Konnichiwa. That means good afternoon.
And Kermit D, Grog, aka Andrew.
Konnichiwa.
Well, we're friends who've been watching anime for a long time, talking about that anime as well as the manga that we're reading. And so those conversations turned into this podcast. We have a lot of fun recording, and we hope you'll have a good time listening. Don't forget to check us out on social media, rate the podcast wherever you can, and tell your friends. You can find links in the description and on our website, animepodcasterreincarnation.com. So today, even though this is episode 19, we're going to be doing a introductory episode. This is the beginner's guide to anime and manga.
Oh.
So we have a bunch of friends who aren't really into anime and manga, but we've talked about having this podcast, and they're not into it, so they'll listen to an episode here or there, but they obviously miss a lot and can't really take it all in. So we decided to get some questions from them and talk about what manga and anime is, how to get into it, and those kind of things.
Really rob them of a polite excuse for not listening to our podcast.
Well, that's the idea, yeah.
Yep.
So, hello to all of our friends listening.
Yes,
Thank you
welcome.
for listening to this. I hope you can get through the whole thing and get some good information out of it. So to kick things off, I think the first thing we want to talk about is what is anime and manga. And we've talked about this a bit in past episodes, but that was definitely from a perspective of people who are already immersed in it. So for people who are maybe, apprehensive to get into it, or, just haven't had the time or interest to check it out.
Or just don't really know what it is at all and just kind of heard of it from a distance.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing that I want to get out of the way for everybody, the biggest thing and probably the biggest takeaway from all of this is just to say that anime is just a cartoon and manga is just a comic book.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to. There's obviously a lot of connotations that anime and manga have for people. Some of my friends that I've talked to have said like, oh yeah, anime, that's the sci-fi or, cyberpunk stuff, right? And because they only saw stuff in the 80s and 90s.
I was going to say, they sound like they're my age.
Yeah. But the thing is, even back then to some degree, but definitely these days, definitely. Anime and manga cover every single genre. There's so many different styles. There's really something for everybody, from kids to adults, in much the same way that American, or rather Western, media has cartoons and comics aimed at adults.
Yeah, they are. I always talk about this with cartoons, I guess in general, which anime is. Anime and manga is a medium, not a genre.
Right.
They can contain many genres. Do they kind of usually edge towards certain ones? Yeah. In the same way that we have like comic books in the West, people usually think of like, oh, it's superheroes. And it's like, yes, That's a large portion of it, but that in no way describes the entire, set of what a comic book, a manga, a graphic novel can be.
And to that extent, I would actually say, and this might just be the fact that I have not immersed myself in Western comics the same way that I have in Japanese comics, but it seems to me that manga has a much wider spread of genre than Western comics. There's definitely lots and lots of different genre in Western comics, but it seems like they do focus the most on superhero stuff.
Yeah. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, because we've talked about it a little bit in other episodes, and we could talk about it again in its own episode, but There's a little bit of a history for why the vibe of anime and manga can be a little bit different than animation and comics. Because America had the Comics Code Authority, which stunted the industry.
Right.
Japan never had that, so they were allowed to keep making things that pushed boundaries, whereas American comics got set back probably like 30 years in terms of that. And at the same time, there's also more serious animation in Japan. Cartoons are not considered a thing for only children or only comedy. They're not as silly, but that's partly a budgetary thing. In Japan, you can make infinite special effects in an animation for a fixed budget, whereas they would never be able to attempt a Hollywood budget. Probably even to this day, but certainly not back in the 80s and 90s. That's why so much of the sci-fi stuff got animated rather than filmed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to bring up because I believe, I don't remember where, but just recently I was privy to a conversation where people were talking about how anime, and to an extent manga, but anime specifically, allows you to have characters express more and like have greater action and everything like that just wouldn't work live action. Or if you did it live action and use CG, it would just look silly. And so to that extent, the medium of a cartoon, but Japan has done this very well, allows an author or a director to really sort of get more emotional beats across.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the recommendation section, but there are definitely directors who have been given a script and then made a choice whether to go animation or live action. And that's not something that we really do in the West. Cartoons, I think it's getting more acceptable mostly because of anime, though.
Yeah.
For a serious drama to be animated. That's not something we really consider. Like a PG-13 serious drama is not something you would expect to see animated in the West, but it's not considered unusual in Japan.
Right.
But just to be clear, though, it's not as much the norm as some anime fans would like to think. I do think there's a thing in the community where this isn't for kids, guys. And like you guys said, it runs the gamut. Certainly, a lot of it is actually for kids.
Yeah. And I think that's probably another really important point to bring up, because I think when a lot of people think of anime or manga, they think of the community. And as we've talked about before on this podcast, the anime and manga community, while there are pockets of it that are great, and I've spoken about them before, there is a lot of that community who not so great. For one reason or another, and a lot of them tend to be, teenage to mid-20s, and they haven't really, well, we don't really need to go into it, but the point is,
that.
It lends itself to obsession, collection, nerdiness.
I just want to get the point across that if you are starting to look into anime and manga as a potential,
your Google search results could be misrepresenting. Right. Yeah.
You should temper your journey into anime and manga with the knowledge that some things there's people out there that you're definitely not going to agree with. But that happens in Western cartoons too.
It happens in anything.
I think I mentioned, the Rick and Morty fandom. I mean, that's a cartoon. It's aimed at adults. The fandom of that show, a lot of them aren't great.
A little rancid.
That doesn't mean the show is bad.
Yeah, it's very much saying I like anime and manga these days. It's like saying I like novels or TV.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's probably a huge chunk of it you would not like.
And this is going to sound silly coming from someone who is on a podcast about anime and manga, but I think it's the people who make it their entire lives, like make it their personality.
Their identity, yeah.
Yeah.
And
I'm special because I know a lot about anime.
that we are doing this because we enjoy it, but it doesn't really bleed into our day-to-day lives that much.
No, and there's a second challenge because there's a whole economy based around exploiting the people who
Yeah.
make it their identity. There's a lot of corporations that encourage you to do that pander to it, that will happily sell you all the merch and the stuff at like a $1 Japanese candy bar for $10.
Yeah.
Consider us your VIP introduction to what you need to know, and kind of avoid all that. And then once you get your feet in the water safely in our high-end bathhouse, can go where you then desire.
Yeah. And,
Equipped with the knowledge.
if you have decided that you're gonna look into it more and maybe discover some other communities and stuff, listen to some of our other episodes. I've mentioned Shonen Flop and Kawaii Disappointment. These are good communities of good people. You'll get good recommendations there. Just try not to just go out on your own. That's probably not the way to go.
Seek a guide.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, the thing that I want to get across the most, anime and manga is just cartoons and comics. There's sometimes a cultural thing in there where an anime or manga will assume a Japanese viewer or reader. And so they're not going to explain certain things that might be necessary to understand the story.
Yeah, there is an intangible vibe to it. Even to this day, I mean, we talk about it on Heroin Addiction every now and then. I can tell if it's written in Japan, Korea, or China.
Yeah.
Or America, obviously. But there's definitely a vibe to it. The vibe is not always the same, but there's something like Japanese about it. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an ingredient.
I would say, for the most part, especially newer stuff that you might be looking at, that's sort of going away. We're sort of becoming more like each other all the time.
There's a big feedback loop, but
Yeah.
so far I can still tell.
Yeah.
There's just
Yeah.
a difference in the way things are produced.
And for the most part, if you're not looking at something that is like, this place takes place in Tokyo or whatever, those kind of references to like Japanese culture are going to be much more few and far between.
No, the intangible thing is there's a Japanese cultural influence, but it's not so much a specific cultural knowledge you need to have. You'll just eventually pick up that there are certain ways of different lenses to look through the world at.
Yeah.
It's a flavor. It's a style, and yeah, you've maybe come across it kind of inspired by and aped over here in the West, but it is just it's been sitting and marinating in a different flavor liquid than we do over here or in other places of the world, and that makes it very specific, and there's so much of it and it's very popular that it kind of forms what it is. So I think it's also helped. I know we said, manga and anime is just comics and cartoons. I would say some of that is that manga, by and large, is generally written by one person, which is not really something we have over here as much, where we have either a writer's room or like comic books where it's like, yeah, this comic is written by this person. Like sometimes somebody gets an entire run, or it's like, oh, this guy's got Green Lantern for a while, and then this person's going to take over. Mm-hmm. And there they have sometimes very long-running stories all helmed by one singular person. And that kind of singularity of voice can create something that's very distinct that we might not see as much here, which is part of that flavoring that I think is something that can make it special.
Well, and because it's one person, the biggest thing is the writer and the artist are the same person.
Usually.
You're not going to get as much of like, in American comics, it's very common to have a writer, pencil, ink, colors be 4 different people.
Editor.
Yeah, and there's sometimes
They still got editors over there.
Yeah.
Well, and, as we say that, there's actually something that's happened in the past, what's it been, 10, 15 years or so, where someone writes a novel, a light novel, and that gets converted into a manga or an anime, or both, which is sort of more towards that Western style of multiple people. But a lot of times, yeah, like you said, it's one person that's doing the writing and the drawing, and so you have a more singular voice It's less of a design by committee kind of thing.
It can make finding things a very all over the place for worse. And I would also say for better, where you can't really... There is a certain flavor to all of it, but all of them can taste very different depending on who's at the wheel. You don't just get that kind of committee thing, which can generate good things.
Oh,
but
yeah.
There's a certain weird uniqueness of things that can get made, and then... they're making it mostly week by week, and they can catch on in popularity or they can die out. Like, there's just always a lot of, ships, which I guess is the same of Western comics, but, like, I don't follow those as much, so I don't think they're as much like, hey, your sales are down, so your series is cut and it's done.
Well, I'd say
or your series is due gangbuster, keep making more. Like,
there's probably two levels to that conversation depending on who you're recommending to. If you're a person who is into comic books, then there's a lot of stuff you would notice that's different right off the bat, which is the vast majority of manga are published in anthology magazines, 1 or 2 chapters at a time.
Which we don't really have. The Western comics don't really have that.
No.
we have single issues, yeah.
We used to. Again, it got broken up.
I guess the difference is, like, when you go to a store and you buy your single issue comic, it's only 15 pages. They're very small.
Magazine, yeah.
Whereas even smaller than that, I'd say, yeah.
Yeah, and so you're going to pay $3, $5, $7. I don't know how much they cost anymore.
Some of it depends on if it's colored or not. Some of it depends on which company has it. If it's just a little bit more.
Yeah,
boutique.
a typical Japanese anthology magazine is like the size of a small phone book, if you remember phone books. But that's where the dropping of a series comes, because in America, dropping series isn't as much of a thing because the intellectual property ownership is also different. Like Marvel owns Spider-Man, the writer doesn't own Spider-Man. But in Japan, it's more of a co-op between the publisher and the author. No one else writes that author's characters without that author's permission. And I would say one other thing is it's usually black and white. Almost all manga is black and white with the exception of special issues.
Yeah, when they do, a lot of times they'll do color like one page or one spread in color and then go right back to black and white. If you see one that is like the whole thing is in color, it's like, this is special for some reason.
Yeah, sometimes very popular series will get like color releases.
There's actually one that I started reading a little while ago that is completely color the whole way through. And it was only after a couple pages where I went, wait a minute, this is all in color. And I don't know why. It's just the whole thing's color.
There's a lot. And this is probably another one to shuffle off into a manga-specific episode, but I think comic fans would be interested to know that goes back to it being one artist, but as digital art becomes more of a thing, the coloring becomes more doable in the time frames they're allotted. But these magazines have due dates, and that's why artists are writing week to week. They're pushing for a chapter a week, and a chapter can be like 5 to 15 pages. And a typical American monthly comic is about 15 pages.
A month and not a week. And there's a whole team of, like you said, somebody's drawing it, somebody's writing it, somebody's inking it, somebody's doing the typesetting. Like, not to say that the authors in Japan don't have assistants and whatnot, but the like roles are a lot more.
The roles are different. They're doing background
The creative
sketching,
load is spread out more than just like, here is the artist. They're drawing the characters. They're drawing the backgrounds. They're this, and unless they have like, hey, assistant, you're drawing that this time.
There's also, for better or for worse, and probably for worse, a real difference in work ethic from Japan. I continually see messages on like Twitter or news places where it's like, oh, this manga author is taking a break because their health is really poor because they worked way too much.
It's not uncommon for mangaka, which is the author and artist of a manga, to be underpaid and overworked. To get 5 pages fully rendered out in a week.
Not that Western comic authors and artists aren't underpaid.
It's never a glamorous job, but I'd rather, if I had to pick, I'd rather be an American artist than a Japanese artist.
So as I mentioned, I collected some questions. Kermit also collected some questions from people. Ben is too embarrassed to talk to anybody in real life about this, so he did not.
I feel like that's a major theme of this episode.
I actually, in general, I don't know that many people who have not tried anime and manga. I think if you're around me long enough, I eventually get you.
But yeah, so we got these questions, and we're just gonna go through them, and we'll see what happens. So first off, I want to give a shout out to my friend Jared, who gave us a couple questions here, and he was the first one. He replied within an hour. So thanks, Jared, for kicking that off. So Jared writes, so I've always wondered where's a good place to start with manga, because it's such a different form of media, and I don't know where you can actually read it. Anime is a little easier to find on streaming sites. So the first part here, and there's more to his question that we'll get into, but I just want to cover this real quick. When we get to our recommendation section, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth. But it is something to note that in general, it is harder to find anime than it is regular cartoons. But you will find them in a lot of places that you probably already have access to. The big one being Netflix. Netflix has a bunch of anime. So just right off the bat, I think that's a good place to get into it. As far as manga, that's even more difficult. And there's not really a great place that people are already at to
reading things are not like it's not like, oh, everybody knows what Netflix is. There's not like a reading app in general people are aware of.
Now, I know
it be for books, anime, or books, American comics.
Ben's going to tell us
manga.
that if you have Amazon Prime, you have Comixology.
Well, I don't know if you have Comixology automatically, but there's some stuff on there. But also, manga's not super obscure. You'd find it wherever you'd find trade paperbacks of any comic.
Yeah, I could say non-digitally, actually going to your local big box bookstore.
Library.
I know. Library also. Library's a little bit more, depends on your local library. But I would say we have Barnes and Nobles near us, and occasionally we have a Books A Million. Their manga sections are usually fairly well put together. Some of them we will have and even have little like summary cards that shout out like popular series, so you can like if you don't know where to start, just next time like pop in and like there's a lot of them. The section's getting bigger and bigger every time, and just look for something that grabs your eye. That's the joy of the written images. You can literally judge it by its cover and go, I'll check this out, or like I'll write this down to look into later. Like you can see what visually grabs you and follow your interest via that, and not necessarily maybe thumb through it.
I have one piece of advice for that though, if you're going to be buying it, especially.
Well, I just wanted to note real quick, if you go and you're going to buy something to hold in your hand and read, generally what you'll find is those come in volumes, so it's not going to be a complete series in one book, but it'll be 7 to 10 chapters of 15 to 20 page chapters each, and those are generally like $10 to $15. So it's not a huge ask, but that is you're committing to some degree.
Correct. And you kind of want to start at book one, which hopefully they have for the more popular series, but sometimes between bookstores or libraries, certain numbers can go missing, but you're starting out. So something I forgot about, which we'd have to tell non-regular readers of manga that people haven't come across it, is that it reads right to left, which to me now feels simple and small, but is actually really important. Most manga translated into the West keep that. I think there's some older ones, and maybe there might be certain companies that do it. I don't know about them.
They do that anymore.
For the most part, they go right to left. I know the major...
that was translated and brought over back then.
Well, yeah,
they just continued to publish it in the same way.
Yeah, that one's kind of culture that. But yeah, Shonen Jump, who's kind of like the big manga publisher that people know, at least in the West, at least for our point of view, even has always had a section that says like, hey, when you open the book from the start
Right,
from
the
the
very
left side, they're like,
last
hey, wait a
page.
minute,
Yeah.
you got to start from the other side, and they have like a little write up about that, and also how to read the panels. Like that's an interesting thing reading if you just come across a panel of a comic online. Even the way that you read through the panels is also right to left. There's
Yeah.
a certain order that. It's one of these problems where it's like I've been doing this for so many years that like it comes second nature. So like luckily, at least with those, they give you a little handy dandy guide about how it's like, hey, or you would read kind of from this. If that word bubble's here, you'd go here in the flow of them.
There's a funny thing about that. As someone who reads so much manga, and I read it on my computer, I'll be reading it for a long time, and then I'll be going on like Reddit or whatever and looking at, little memes or comics or anything. And I'll sometimes find myself reading things in the wrong direction.
I've definitely, if they tickle the manga part of my brain enough, I will accidentally read them right to left and be confused. And sometimes I have to like take a moment and like, which of these directions makes more sense? That'll dictate how I move forward. So something functional to be aware as a beginner is that it reads right to left page wise, and also in the actual, not frames. What's the word that I want?
Panels.
The panels of the comic.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say is you explained about the $10 volumes. You're also going to see bigger volumes, which are usually omnibuses. And then the omnibus will happen with either a very long series that has been out for a while. They compile the reprint, like the second or third, fourth printing of the series. They'll combine that down into omnibuses. Or there are series that are just kind of middle length that they will print as omnibuses just because it makes the most sense. Those are more expensive, but my recommendation would be if you're looking to try out manga just to see if you like it in general, we could get into more specific recommendations in the recommendations section, but you'd want to pick a genre you like, and you want to pick something that's short and something that's finished.
Yeah, that's actually really important because
These things go on for years.
yeah,
Sometimes
which
for
is-
decades in very rare cases.
it's very similar to Western comics in that regard. But a lot of times in Western comics, you'll have arcs, and people think of those as like a complete.
You have runs in
Yeah.
Western
Yes.
comics where you have one writer telling basically one story, and then they bow out and a new one comes in with the characters and picks up. And you want to try to get in at a run if you're doing a Western comic, but arcs don't work quite the same way
there's
in
no
manga.
there's no get in point but the beginning.
Yeah.
Pretty much. It's not just like, oh, I generally know who Spider-Man is. Like you said, a new author's taken over. There's a new run. I'll hop in here and you can kind of pick up on the go what's happening. But that's not really as possible with manga, which is why I stress if you're buying it in person, make sure it's got a 1 on the spine, or you're going to have a real rough time.
But I tell you, somebody who reads this, even if you're going online, now the subscription services are cheap.
I forgot to mention.
Yeah.
So probably the best place to really get into it is Viz. So Viz Media, they own Shonen Jump. They're one of the biggest publishers there is. They have a subscription service on their site. I think you actually have to pay for it on the app now. But it's like $2 or $3 a month. They have two.
Okay,
now,
so let me
right?
explain this because I'm the one that's deep into
we'll
this.
get into that.
Okay.
At
I
that
pay
point.
for both of them.
I also pay for both of them.
But one thing that's
worth
important to note is you can go on there and you can read like the first 3 chapters
of any
anything
series
on
they
there,
have. So that is the perfect
for free.
You can poke your head in. You can go, hey, does this speak to me? And if it doesn't, you move on. And they have so many series, both currently running and prior. And now that between the 2 apps, there is 100% completely different libraries. So just like all sorts of genres are now very accessible. They're nice to download apps. There's no extra ads. They are great to read on tablet or otherwise. I would highly, highly, highly recommend if you want to try getting into manga to either on your desktop computer or on your phone or your tablet to get the Viz Media app and the Shonen Jump app. The interfaces are the same. You would make one account for both of them. And like Brad said, the first 3 chapters
The first
for
3
everything on those apps.
and the 3 latest chapters which means if you start reading something that's brand new that only has like 3 chapters, you could potentially read it forever for free.
Yes, or give the money because
It's a really good deal.
the deal is so good. We're not getting paid by them. I wish we were, but like genuinely
they don't make enough money to pay.
you're probably subscribed to something like Netflix or Max or something. You're like, oh my gosh, this price keeps going up. I don't feel like I'm getting a value to it. The Shonen Jump and the Viz stuff is like dollars a month. It's not even a full coffee.
I think it's $5 between the both of them.
It's collectively now for both giant libraries. It's about $5. I think $3 for the Shonen Jump one, $2 for Viz, and it's a great way, even without paying for the subscriptions, to just poke your head in and go again. Look through the covers. Go, which one's talking to me? And just see what catches your eye and, read a chapter or two. Usually the first chapter is extra long so they can get in a bunch of, hey, here's what the story is. Here's what the story is going to be like. And it's a perfect getting on point of like, hey, I like this. I'm going to keep going. Or I'm not really about this. And there are dozens of other series you can try. So highly recommended.
And before we move on to the rest of Jared's question here, because he specifically mentioned anime. I mentioned Netflix before, which everybody probably already has, but you do have to pay for.
It's on every streaming service now.
But you can actually... So Crunchyroll is the anime streaming service. You can actually watch stuff on Crunchyroll for free.
So
it's ad-supported. Yeah.
Ad-supported, okay.
The one thing I want to say is, with the Viz stuff, I love the Viz subscriptions. It's a good place to start for a certain kind of manga. Mm-hmm. It depends what you want to get into. Shonen Jump is a magazine in Japan called Weekly Shonen Jump. And the Shonen Jump app does comics almost exclusively from that particular magazine, which is geared at 14-year-old boys.
Yeah.
Which some of it is more goes, beyond that.
They've evolved a lot over the years, but it's still, I'd say, like YA if you're comparing it to novels.
And that means young adult for everybody who is not immersed in books like you are.
Boomer. But
I mean, some of
the Viz app is a little more diverse. Like the Viz library versus the Shonen Jump. Viz is a
very
publisher.
very different.
Yeah, but there's also, if you're into more like, I would say, older teen adult, like your Frank Miller type comics, like Sin City or something like that. Yeah. Dark Horse licenses most of that stuff still.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And they have an app too. I don't know if it's a subscription, but you can get things on there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So Jared goes on to ask, also, I don't get it. I've never read comics or manga.
Oh.
What's the appeal? Why are people so interested in it? I'm not really a reader. Is manga vastly different that I should give it a chance?
I mean, if he's not reading comics, you're reading a book, but there's pictures, which makes it sound like you're reading a children's book. But as somebody like I, at some point many years ago, changed over to pretty much I read exclusively nonfiction and like full written out book, and my like fictional stories I take in via manga and graphic novels, just because I find it more interesting that you get to have that visual component of like keeping track of what characters look like, or like action moments, or just the way things flow. It's like you're reading storyboards of a movie. In some ways,
I've never really found like a book describing action to really work that well. I know that there's some that can.
As a book reader, I'll agree with you for the most part.
So being able to see something visually, now obviously in anime, it's a completely different thing because you can see it in motion.
With sound.
Even just with the picture, and you have speed lines and stuff like that, you get a much better idea of like what the author is trying to convey is happening.
I'll give you my quick pitch for why you might want to try it. I'm not going to guarantee you'd like it. And this goes for comics as well. And novels. Basically, the less effort something takes to produce, the more people can produce it. The more, when you're watching TV and movies exclusively, you're seeing stories that have gone through a pretty intense filtration process for marketability, feasibility. You can tell grander, more epic stories in a comic than you can tell in a movie.
Yeah.
You can tell more singularly voiced.
Yeah.
Stories.
And you don't need, it doesn't need to be marketable. It can appeal to a niche audience. And it is also the ground where a lot of people experiment with new ideas. Successful comics will probably be turned into a movie, and that's when you'll probably encounter them. And especially if you like action movies or anything, you're probably going to find that a lot of your favorite action movies were comics.
But also other genres too. There's
Yeah.
been a number of like graphic novels, and I mean, obviously manga by and large, if they're popular, become anime. But like there is a variety of things that aren't necessarily just actiony things that work well with a visual medium. And like Ben said, because it's cheaper, it can be more singularly voiced about something you wouldn't normally expect a show or a movie out of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if you ever get that vibe that you're kind of sick of seeing the same thing over and over in TV and movies, because they take a while to shift trends. Like I think the superhero thing is kind of being whittled down to like the gems now. It's not as flooded. That stuff happens way faster in the comics market and the novel market.
I think there's also something to be said about consumability in terms of like, if you read a chapter of a manga, or even 2 or 3, you know, reading one chapter is going to take you like between 5 and 10 minutes.
Oh yeah, some
At
of those
most.
series, I freaking pop those things like Tic Tacs.
Yeah.
They're delicious. It's like that was really compelling. I'm gonna go to the next chapter. Like
So-
they are perfect for, especially now that I've kind of shifted to like reading on my tablet or phone. I'm out killing time somewhere.
Yeah.
Let me pull out my phone, go on the Viz app, and pick up from where I left off reading some long series. Like
It's-
they're really great for pick up, read a couple, put it back down.
It's much less of a commitment to read a chapter or 2 of a manga than it is to be like, I'm going to watch an episode of a television show.
Or I'm going to read like a book. I feel like
Yeah.
in those situations, it's like I need to be at home. I need to be in the right environment. I need to sit down. But there's just something about that added visual portion of it that lets my brain clock into it quicker and roll with it. And again, that's not necessarily exclusive to manga. That's just a general comic thing. But
Yeah,
if you've touched neither,
I think the sequential art's kind of the best of both worlds between the novel and the movie.
yes.
You can get crappy art.
Yeah.
That's a factor.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can get art that you would hang on your walls in these comics. Like sometimes you will have an emotional reaction to the art. If you read it long enough, I guarantee you'll find it at least once.
So last part of Jared's question here, and I think a bunch of this we did cover already. So, but also in discussion with his wife has led to what's the difference between manga and a comic, which we went over to some degree. Is manga supposed to be funny? Is manga and anime the same? What are the differences? Is an anime a manga animated, or is it different stories? Is an anime just a cartoon? How can I take it more seriously than other animations?
So the difference between manga and comics is basically nil. The manga is a Japanese comic. And in Japan, the word komiksu is probably used more than manga to describe what they are. Manga is sort of how we in the West call Japanese comics because it means comics technically. It means whimsical pictures, funny pictures, funny books like comics.
See,
used to
the
be
funny
called.
papers, kid.
So, yeah, Japanese people tend to use komiksu to describe them. So they're the same.
Now, it should be noted, there's lots of manga that is comedy, that it is supposed to be
A
funny.
gag manga, as it's
A
known.
gag manga is definitely like a huge thing. So it's not strange that you've probably heard it in that context.
Yeah. Covers all genres, though.
But it's not necessarily like here's Garfield, or it's not like Sunday comics. If that's your
They do
if
have
that's
those,
your
though.
window in, there are, but that's
What
not.
is it called? 4-koma or something like that?
Yeah,
Yeah, they're 4 panels. Yeah.
they have those. So manga originally, like the word, it kind of relates to like funny pictures or something, but it was initially drawn for kids to be fun. There's other stuff. These are terms we'll get into in the term section, but like manga and gekiga are both comics. They're
Yeah.
both kinds of comic. And like I said, in Japan, it's not as strange for comic books to be marketed specifically to adults. It's not like every comic, like some people would like to think it is, but it's not unusual. They wouldn't find it strange that this comic is geared towards adults. That being said, I would also mention, like, it is still kind of nerdy in Japan. Like, most adults in Japan do not read comics.
Comics is still nerdy. And
Yeah. I would take it.
But
like,
it's becoming, I mean, even over here, it's becoming more of a thing. I think the whole superhero boom helped with that, and at least some of those people stick around and read other things.
Yeah, and I think part of what attracted me to manga specifically versus American comics or Western comics is there was a wider variety of stories being told.
Yeah.
American comics are just now coming out of that damage that was done by the Comic Book Code Authority. And I can't say that enough. And most of the interesting work being done in comics right now is not being done by Marvel or DC or any of those.
Agreed.
It's being done by indie comics who are under like Image or something. And that's a whole different conversation.
So anime and manga, definitely different. Anime is, moving pictures.
It's literally just animation.
Yeah.
It's the Japanese word is animation, and anime is the shortening of that. It means animation.
I know before I was cognizant of things, supposedly back in the day it was referred to as Japanimation, which I only know from an old Homestar Runner Strong Bad joke.
That was around. There were magazines called Japanimation.
It does flow off the tongue well.
So yes,
I probably would not use that term, but
anime is just a cartoon. And as far as is anime a manga animated, that does happen a lot.
yes, but
A lot of anime is made based on a popular manga.
You could ask the same question: is a movie just a book filmed?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's like that. There are some movies that are completely original from script to filming. There are some movies that are based on an existing work, text, play, whatever.
some of the most standout anime I've seen have been original works, but they are very the big budget ones are very, very rare, but usually when those show up they're worth looking at. But as Brett said, by and large they are usually based off of a manga.
It should be noted that Japan makes a lot of anime, and because of that, they have time slots to fill. So a lot of times what will happen is they will just grab a few popular manga and make them into anime in order to, fill those time slots.
I would say it is really not dissimilar to the film industry in America. It's just we have the higher budget and the greater audience for live action.
Yeah.
Also movies as opposed to television.
Look
in
at
this case.
Even television, so much TV now, especially like Netflix and Hulu and them. They were buying up every single property.
Yeah.
No one sells a book these days without also simultaneously selling the film rights. So it's kind of like that. Manga usually comes out first. Like I said, it's easier to make. It establishes an audience. People like the safe bet. That's what comes.
You're not going to see, I guess, actually, this is something really important to talk about. If you're not familiar with that, usually I feel like a lot of the times in the West, when a book or something is made into a TV show or a movie, there are going to be changes. Maybe how it looks visually, casting, some of the story beats. By and large, a manga to an anime, you're pretty much getting the same story. Mm-hmm. Very rarely will there be changes. At most, there will be a visual change because sometimes there are character designs you can draw on a page, but you can't animate at however many frames they're doing it moving around.
And sometimes they'll cut stuff out, like certain story elements or something, but for the most part,
by and large, they are the manga honed in a little bit more or something. Some manga to anime can kind of gain some more power, depth, appeal that they didn't have in still images, but that's kind of a series to series
usually
situation.
When there's like a creative liberty taken, it's some problem with the source material. Either the source material isn't finished and they have to fill time until they get more of the source material, so they come up with original stuff, which is called filler. We have a whole episode about that if you're curious. Or the source material like ended abruptly.
Yeah.
So sometimes they'll try to round out the corners.
I guess my point more is you're not going to read something and then be like, they screwed it up completely when they made it into a movie. Where was this character? This character, like, you're not going to get, like, they completely changed the characterization of this person. It's fairly consistently here it is in motion with sound.
Get yourself a Witcher situation going on.
Yeah.
So to finish off, Jarrett, the most important part here, how can I take it more seriously than other animations? To which I want to say, don't. It's not. And it comes down to the individual series.
Depends what you mean by take it seriously. So one of the things I'm going to recommend is a movie by a Japanese film director, Satoshi Kon. He's won numerous Oscar-like awards. He is a serious filmmaker who makes serious movies, not for children. He has one that is like a psychological thriller, and I would not go into that expecting it to be a goofy, ha-ha cartoon. It will shock and disturb the way it would if it were live-action people. So if you mean take it seriously in terms of get super protective of it and weird about it, don't do that.
Don't.
But if you're gonna treat it as something that could actually affect you as an adult with adult human emotions, just understand that not all of these are made by people trying to sell toys. Some of these are made by serious filmmakers.
And I think Kermit said it best earlier. It's just another medium.
It's a medium. It's from somewhere else, which makes it different, but that doesn't put it on a pedestal. This is their Peanuts, this is their Superman, this is their other comics that I don't know that are super popular or whatever, but this is their pop culture, and what makes it different is that it's different than our pop culture to an extent. It doesn't make it better, it doesn't make it worse, just be open to something different.
Yeah. So next we got a question from someone we all know, a friend of all of us, Chris.
Oh, God.
Antagonist to the podcast, Chris.
What?
I said antagonist to the podcast, Chris.
Why is he an antagonist?
I just thought it was funny. Very interesting human, Chris.
Yeah.
I know for a fact.
Very peculiar human.
Chris has watched anime. At least one.
I'd be very curious how he felt about it.
So Chris's question, there are a few graphic novels that transcend their genre status and are considered notable works of art or literature to a general audience. Watchmen being a prime example. Studio Ghibli films have achieved this status for anime. What other anime or manga would you put in this category?
Okay, two forks. One, I feel like we would talk about what the other ones are in the recommendation section. Yeah. Two, as I've admittedly got my own beef, but as somebody who has consumed a lot of anime, I would argue that Studio Ghibli films are not that, I mean, again, it's a genre, but if you're talking about the anime that is generally popular in the West, Studio Ghibli does not capture whatever that is. Again, I'm also speaking from a bias that I really don't like the Studio Ghibli films I've seen. At best, I've been bored by them, but I've never felt this is anime. Where I've seen other anime movies that I'm this feels like anime, even if it's doing something really different and unique. But Studio Ghibli always felt even though it's anime, that it's not, if that makes any sense. I don't know if this is its own episode, not for beginners topic, but I don't think it's as indicative as the whole. If you take a bite of that, I don't think what you're going to taste in your mouth is going to be indicative if you just take here's the anime apple I've pulled from the general popular bucket. I don't think the bite you get from that is going to taste the same. I think it's going to be an alien taste to you, even if they're technically the same thing. But I guess that further reinforces my point that anime is a medium and not a genre, and it's not, there are many, many different things in it. I would just say, of the whole, even though they are very popular across a lot more lines, I would say Studio Ghibli films are not as indicative as the popular whole.
I mean, maybe that's a good, he asked, does it transcend the genre status?
And I would say, I guess, yeah. And there are other ones that I'm sure we will talk about in the recommendation segment. But I would say, yes, there are some. And then maybe, I guess, Studio Ghibli is that for some people. Just not me.
I would say... I mean, Studio Ghibli's won Oscars. So that's like, whether you like it or not, it did make it. But...
Is it because they're very not anime? And I say that as like a not the medium, but the like in the kind of air quotesy connotation of it.
That's a different
weird.
episode.
That's a different episode.
But I would say there are definitely a few. Everything I will recommend, I would say, transcends, and I think we're mostly talking about anime. We didn't recommend a lot of manga.
I've got some manga in here, but for the most part, we're sort of focusing on anime because it's sort of easier to get into.
But I would say for Chris specifically, I'd say there's one, I think it's called Lone Wolf and Cub.
Yeah.
I would say that transcends. I would say that's like a must-read comic book. Yeah,
unfortunately for Chris, there aren't really any kind of like historical nonfiction anime. So historical fiction, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Historical nonfiction, not so.
It's like, hey, have you heard this anime I can't stop talking about called Golden Kamuy?
There's no anime documentaries, but to Studio Ghibli.
Why hasn't that happened yet? That feels.
Grave of the Fireflies.
Did they make documentaries over? Oh God, Ben.
To an extent.
If you just want to feel terrible for a while, Grave of the Fireflies. I own it on DVD. Studio I've only ever watched it once.
Does Japan make documentaries?
Yeah.
I feel like is there? I feel like. Where is our Japanese Spinal Tap or The Office, our anime version of those?
The anime Office would be hilarious.
Like, like you saying that, I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen that. That feels like it's ripe for an anime take on, like, we're in a quirky office, or like, it's a shonen.
It's not a Gretzko
battle thing. Yeah, a little bit, I guess. But the whole thing that there are, like, cameras present and that you get the cutaways. Like, I'd be curious to see what that looks like through the anime manga lens.
Sanrio is a whole other episode.
Yeah, that's it.
So, Chris, make sure you stay tuned for the recommendation section. Next, we have a question from Josh, who is the entire reason we're doing this episode. Shout out, Josh. I shouted him out last episode on Review Stravaganza.
Are you watching yet, Josh?
He didn't listen to it. He told me, I think that is too much inside baseball for me. And I went, what?
I mean,
we didn't even talk about the baseball episode.
That's a later episode. That might be next week, actually, or next episode.
So, Josh, I hope you're listening. You'll hear from me if you aren't. Josh asks, how closely do anime and manga follow the trends in Japanese culture? In the 80s and 90s, they seemed to be heavily slanted to sci-fi, war, and post-war themes. Now most anime I try to watch on Netflix are basically incomprehensible to me. They are very introspective and meta. Like there are certain rules and standards I should know about that I'm not aware of. Like how they never explain artificial gravity in spaceships, but we just accept it.
I think he means like stuff like that, not how anime specifically does that. Like you just need to know that they have artificial gravity on Star Trek.
I guess they do talk about it a little bit at some point in Star Trek, but that's what I was going to say. Is like
it's
Star
like an
Trek
accepted thing.
Yeah. I mean,
where do we start?
Lots of space, sci-fi, Western media glosses over a lot of that stuff.
So I would say like there's degrees, obviously. Does it follow the trends in Japan? I mean, yeah.
It also has trends that it follows. Whether that is indicative of all of Japan, I personally could not speak to that. But as somebody who's been reading a lot of manga and Shonen Jump and seeing certain ideas pop up in other knockoff ones that don't last very long and see which ones get popular, there are definitely trends that it is fun to see pop up and die out over a course of a few years.
It follows certain trends, but I'd say it's cyclical, like a lot of what we've been talking about, the influences. Like, you can't possibly underestimate what Star Wars did to anime. Star Wars changed everything. That was a big reason you started seeing all of the space stuff in the 80s and 90s. And also, in the 80s and 90s, there's a huge import bias towards what they thought people would buy. Like, there are entire magazines in Japan dedicated to, I'll explain the term later, shoujo comics, comics for young women. They're very romantic, soap opera type stuff, or sometimes even like mysterious, not action comics, not at all what you would think of. But the bias on the imports was definitely for boys and what boys like. And boys like tech, they like robots, they like weapons. And I think that thinking has changed both in the import thing. Now they're just grabbing up whatever they can. Yeah. And generally globally, I mean, Japan is like what, the third largest economy or something.
I think that's right.
It's pretty big.
It's got international influence.
It's got a market share.
I actually just saw population numbers for Japan recently, and it's a lot higher than I thought it was. It's like 100 million or something like that.
It's still possible. It's still possible to make money in Japan catering only to domestic customers. It's not like China where you need to export to make money.
Although you'd think China would have enough.
There's a lot of people you think, whatever.
It's not just
not
people.
the episode for
it's
it.
Wealth.
Not the podcast for it.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, I'd say you got to be careful. I would avoid anything set in a Japanese school. They're going to assume you know what's going on.
Yeah, and you'll see
a lot
this
of it is set in Japanese schools.
when we start recommending stuff. For the most part, nothing that we recommend is going to have any kind of strong Japanese cultural things in it, because that is something that, you know, can turn people off sometimes because it's a thing they're not familiar with, and you can feel out of place if you aren't familiar with it.
I'd say one of the biggest things you have to get used to a little bit culturally is just like standards of beauty and cuteness. And that there's a lot of inside stuff about that. Like, one of the things that's big different between Japanese comics and anime and American comics and anime is like the portrayal of a masculine character is very different. Like, not a lot of big buff dudes.
The portrayal of a feminine character is
Well,
also,
there's
can also
certainly
be
that. Yeah.
problematic at times depending on the era and what you're reading.
Problematic in a way that is different from the way that Western comics and cartoons are problematic.
There's also a visual language that's different, but becoming more familiar to an American audience, like the hyper exaggerated emotions.
Yeah, and I would say stuff like
the big
visual language is generally something that you'll just come to
You'll pick
recognize
up over time. Yeah.
It's not that big of a deal. It's just when you first get into it, it can maybe feel a little bit weird, I guess.
There's little things that if you've never really spent a lot of time engaging with another culture, surprising the first time you encounter, like the myths are different, the references are different. Right. You'd be surprised how often fairy tales or common stories come up in your day-to-day life. Like if I say somebody's a Scrooge or something, you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah. Right. Cinderella moment.
Yeah. So in Japan, they have stuff like the fox is a trickster. They have...
there's a pantheon of demons and ghosts and stuff that just...
They're not going to explain what a Shinto temple is. They're not going to explain what a charm or a...
But again, the starter series that we're going to be talking about generally will avoid those kind of things. And so it's not really until you start going and exploring on your own
I'd say
that you'll run into that.
They'll avoid them or they'll explain them.
Right.
That's what we tried to focus on, I think.
I would like to also preemptively present a phrase that I have not invented, but definitely co-opted and use a lot, which is anime bullshit.
Oh, God, I thought you were going to say Hamburger Shonen.
No, that's...
And you were going to tell me all about Teen Titans.
That's too inside baseball. It's a future episode. Even though I love Hamburger Shonen as a concept. So sometimes, and it can be in manga as well, it technically could show up in anything, but there's just something about it. It's just like we said, these are stories usually coming out a chapter a week at a time. So it's a lot of the time they're trying to get readers to come back. So the most crazy, inane thing will happen moment to moment.
Yeah.
Especially in an anime where it's then all put together as not just a chapter you're reading a week, and just crazy stuff can be like popping off that then will be explained in a thing. And again, this does not describe all anime or manga, but it describes, again, the shonen that we will define later, that is like the general popular things. If you look at the internet or talk to young people about it, these are the series they'll probably have, where just wild, crazy things are happening. And to a certain extent, that can be more so than I've seen in any other medium. And that can be either very exciting if you're somebody like me who craves craziness and novelty in situations, and some people are like, I don't understand what's going on. What is this? Why is this happening?
I would liken that to, like, if you've seen, like, the DC or Marvel movies, it's like, oh, superhero bullshit. Like, it's a thing that they do that people who like the general genre that is will just go along with.
Yeah, and it's not.
Why can Iron Man get punched through that building, but when he gets punched through that building, he's hurt?
Yeah,
it's not. It's time for him to be hurt.
It's not necessarily or a good or a bad thing. I use it in a sort of like a general thing, because sometimes I love it, and some of that maybe is just that I've grown to love it. But if you're somebody that's like, well, that doesn't make any sense, it's the idea that usually in a situation, an exciting thing is going to a thing is going to happen because it is exciting or compelling, not necessarily that it makes the most sense.
Right.
Well,
and sometimes they can feel like they come out of nowhere, and it's not always like a bad thing, but it's definitely like, as somebody who kind of rides the waves of emotions, I can enjoy that ocean more because you're just kind of rocking and rolling with it and not trying to, stand up against every wave that comes by. Again, not that this describes every anime and manga out there.
What I was going to say was the dramatic language of anime. One of the things that anime gets a terrible rap for is the soliloquies and the extreme telling and not showing. Someone, especially if you're going to go into one of these action manga, or anime, it's gotten better in recent years, which is to say it's gotten more like the American way of doing it. But there is almost always something that happens in these that is incomprehensible or so ridiculous it just simply doesn't make sense, that a third party will have to explain what just happened, because visually it's not readable. And
a running commentary, if you will.
Yeah, that sort of stuff is...
Or someone will declare their stance on something in very clear language.
Yeah, I think that's considered very cheesy and bad storytelling in the West. And
when people do it in Western media, we say the same thing.
Yeah,
right.
But when it shows up in an anime, I call it anime bullshit, and sometimes I love it, and sometimes I think it's dumb. But this is just... That was how... Yeah, you will sometimes find the character who is literally just there to commentate on whatever's going on, so you as the viewer can have a better sense of what is happening in the situation.
You're Watson, if you will.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. Wow.
Right?
Okay,
right?
Mr. Bookman.
No, that connected...
Wow, Ben got bopped.
Yeah, that connected a couple of dots there.
Ooh, Ben got bopped.
What did you think Watson was for?
I knew Watson's a framing device, but I'm not like, is Piccolo Watson?
Robert E.O. Speedwagon? Watson? Same guy? Maybe. They're both from... I don't remember what time period...
Victorian.
They're both from Victorian times.
That's too inside baseball.
That's too inside baseball.
So Josh goes on to ask, is there even a solid definition for anime and manga anymore?
Nope.
To which I will say, no, there isn't. As we mentioned already, cartoons and comics.
Yes, and as you'll know as we get deeper into the actual vocabulary section, words can have definitions, and then they can have connotations that you can only understand by marinating in both them and the community they are used in. I feel like there's going to be a word we're going to attempt to define that's going to be really complicated.
A bit of a bonus question that Josh has here. It's sort of a
bonus,
a departure from the previous stuff, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. Which live action movies are worse, video game adaptations or anime adaptations?
Video game adaptations are supposedly getting better.
That's a hard one because video game adaptations have been very, very, very bad for a very long time.
Is there a good anime adaptation live action film?
Alita's not terrible.
Good.
And that's the thing.
A great. Let's do great.
If we look at Japanese produced anime
gets
for
even more
live action,
complicated.
they tend to be really bad. There are parts of them that are amazing, but overall,
Wigs.
they tend to be bad.
Wigs.
Wigs.
Yeah, don't watch live action anime.
Don't
do that.
I've
Japan.
seen-
Unless you have trained in there and you're ready, you're fully equipped, you've built up your resistance to anime bullshit. Do not touch anime live action, whether they are made in the West or the East. Slight side note exemption from my own biases for Speed Racer. But also,
They
I
did
guess
that
no.
on purpose.
You still actually know. You do need your built-up resistance or vaccination against anime bullshit to truly take in and enjoy the Speed Racer film.
They made that to be like a live action anime.
Yeah, that is the truest expression of it.
Which a lot of people didn't get. It's unfortunate.
Because not everybody's about that style of it. Not everybody's about anime bullshit.
My wife swears by the Kenshin live action movies.
I mean, those
Kenshin?
are probably some of the best live action
I
anime
haven't seen
adaptations.
them.
Which ones
Like,
are those? Is that
Rurouni
Rurouni
Kenshin?
Kenshin?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I know. I remember hearing ages ago about like the sword fights in those were crazy, and I saw some of the clips and they looked, like nothing I had ever seen in a really good way.
I think the reason those ones worked more than others is because they really made a point to sort of just make it a samurai movie.
Yeah, they could just be a martial arts kind of thing.
Yeah.
But they put in some anime flourish into it instead of going, "Oh, Rurouni Kenshin, the anime, we're gonna make that live."
They
action.
didn't give him like a Spirit Halloween red wig. I will die.
No,
on this
actually,
wig.
if I'm remembering properly, his hair is red, but it's very dark red.
Yeah.
That reminds me of one last thing, because I had this revelation fairly recently in my time watching anime. The bigger shonen-y popular anime, approach them like you would a musical. I recently saw clips of Japan has been making musicals out of some of this anime, and it just, as somebody
Stage
who knows
musicals.
theater and is getting into it more and has been watching anime for a long time, it just made sense. So if you approach it more with that kind of a mindset of people are going to sing their emotions, and nobody's singing here, but if you approach it that kind of over the top, to the rafters energy, I think, again, doesn't fit all of it, but it will make a lot more of that kind of stuff make more sense to you, hopefully.
There's almost not a concept of subtle acting in anime.
No.
It does exist.
It does happen.
But it's very rare.
Do you mean anime or do you mean anime? Like that's why it's really difficult with this. Yes, an anime is just a cartoon. It is animation technically from Japan, but that's like the connotation of how you use it and how other people use it makes that complicated.
So moving on to another question here, and this is I think a good one because it's a different perspective I think than a lot of other people. From one of Kermit's friends, Gretchen.
Yes.
She says, as a senior citizen, it's something I just never had an interest in. I guess sports lore / mythology was more up my alley. There were plenty of old school comic books in my day, but I never really cared for them either. I would be interested in historical background info, precursors, cultural factors, leading to their prominence in today's creative and social landscape.
Ben, the mic is yours.
Everybody looks at Ben.
As the historian.
So they want history about what kind of history do you think they're looking for?
I guess so I think something we've covered before where did anime and manga sort of come from? Like why did it become prevalent so much earlier, like for teens and adults rather than just kids, than it did in the West? Because back in the day, probably like before The Simpsons might have been the first real like adult cartoon. everything was for kids. I mean, even Flintstones was for kids.
Flintstone was made for adults.
It just had...
kids watched it then.
Yeah.
It was the 60s. They had commercials for smokes. The Flintstones was made...
Well, they were marketing cigarettes to children
the
back then. So.
True.
So
Flintstones chewable morphine. But, yeah. Regardless...
If you want the history of anime and manga and why they're prevalent, so I can't remember exactly when the first anime came out. Probably it was after World War II. I think the first credited one is Mighty Atom, which is Astro Boy.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And a lot of that was actually aping off of the Walt Disney cartoons. It wasn't a huge, global phenomenon back then. It took a while, but it was by a guy named Osamu Tezuka who started off drawing comics. The comics got big, again, after World War II because they could be printed cheap on cheap paper. You could put them in a library, which is what they did for a lot of them. And the lending library was the primary way of consuming it until they eventually started selling it. And Tezuka, because he had done this Mighty Atom and he had established this brand basically that competed successfully with Popeye in Japan, which was the second most popular cartoon at the time. He became sort of the voice of it all. And as time goes on in Japan, the 50s and 60s, they start seeing more protest movements. The Vietnam War starts ramping up. Japanese youth don't want to be involved in it. They don't want American military bases. There's a lot of protests. And so you get a counterculture that is largely fueled by this cheap, easily consumed pop culture of manga. And so a lot of these counterculture people start making a little bit more intense manga. So I think that's probably the main difference between America and Japan there is our protest movement never really connected with the comics movement. I mean, certainly a lot of people came out of it. Watchmen eventually came out of that era, but not
it wasn't
until later.
Not everybody read Watchmen back in the day. Our counterculture went a lot more in the music scene than it did the comic scene. Yeah. We already had the comics code, but we didn't have that as much in music in the 60s and the 70s when America had its counterculture movement. But that's interesting to see, originally at its root that it got in the counterculture thing, but also, like you said, that especially that early anime stuff is influenced by Disney, and it's almost like this weird Ouroboros snake eating its own tail of the West and America influencing Japan, and then Japan influencing the West. I mean, if you can draw there's a lot of inner lines, but you can easily draw that line from Pinocchio and Snow White and Bambi to, like you said, Mighty Atom, Astro Boy is what it was called in the West then when it came out, and through a series of other lines get to what I would say the current new hot trend in animated film that you see in the likes of Spider-Verse, especially Spider-Verse, the new, Puss in Boots: Last Witch, Michaels vs. the Machines, the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie coming out later this year. I think there's a very clear kind of anime inspiration in all of those. Even though those are also inspired by a lot of other things, including Western comics, you can kind of see each of them playing into each other. And if you watch cartoons, you've probably seen something inspired by something anime, whether it be in the way the story was told, or how it looks, or how it moves, or just certain ideas about it. Each culture has kind of permeated the other in ways that maybe, you would have never noticed.
And I think there's there's an important note there. So as opposed to, a long time ago where, manga sort of originated, there's this, on the Western side where manga and anime sort of started coming over, you really saw sort of the start of that in the 90s, somewhat in the 80s, but really in the 90s where a lot of Western television channels would license the rights to anime, mostly geared at kids. You've got your Pokemon and your Dragon Ball and those kind of things, because it was cheap for them to bring that over, so they could fill time slots with that. they bring that over, and it becomes really popular with kids because, I mean, it's flashing colors and stuff.
Yeah.
It's fun
It's
stuff.
also being specifically translated and geared towards them. And, like,
Right.
still in that era, you're getting a lot more. And even, especially even more before that, where you're getting a lot of erasure of the original Japanese intent. Ben talks about that a lot with a lot of things, where, I mean, even we just had now, it's that it was called the Mighty Atom in Japan, and we know it as Astro Boy. I think Speed Racer has a similar thing. A lot of things get renamed, things get rethemed. I will always, even though I never watched it, I'll always remember that, what is it, in Sailor Moon, there are two girls that are supposed to be
The kissing
lovers,
cousins.
but they don't, yes, they didn't, American TV didn't want that at the time, so they made them cousins, and it's like, oh, they're close because they're family, but in the original, like, and that's happening a lot less now. So if your frame of reference for a lot of this stuff is from further back eras, you're getting more and more, what's the word I would use of it? Like staticky versions of these things that have been kind of, their form has been changed more than it does now, where you're getting it a little bit more directly, you know, not that it's not getting localized, but culturally from where it started, and not like, you know, eat your hamburgers, Ash, where they have their,
and
like, rice balls.
The thing is the evolution of those early ones that sort of did a lot of changes was that, you know, kids were growing up with that. And so as they started to get older, they would go, oh, what was this thing? This is not something from my country. They changed all this weird stuff. And so you have those kids growing up and finding out more about these things that they liked when they were kids, and then demanding more of it. And so you get more and more imports, and as they're growing up, the imports are growing up with them to fit those other audiences.
I mean, when you're a kid, you don't know what anime, like, you don't know what Japan is or anime.
Yeah.
You're just watching Pokemon because it's popular and you like it, and then you're kind of steeping in that. And then, like, Digimon happens, and then Yu-Gi-Oh happens, and all of these kind of bridge lines and all the other things on. But, like, there's, like, a really semi-clear line between these things of just like, oh, I steeped in this thing that wasn't super Japanesey, or the parts of that were changed, but certain parts weren't, and those kind of seep in. And then, like you said, as you touch out to each sort of neighboring thing, you kind of take on more and more of it until you're just like, oh yeah, this is just a thing that I watch.
So there's two things I wanted to add just from the Japanese side is, one, if you're really interested in, like, the deep history of it all, Japanese art is really interesting to go back through the ages in terms of, like, how much of that style from, like, what would have been our, you know, Renaissance period is still preserved today versus how little of our Renaissance period is still preserved. And they've always had a more imaginative, less realistic style. It's always looked more, I don't want to say cartoony, but
Stylized.
maybe stylized. Yeah. And sequential art, like, I've heard the first manga dates back to, like, I don't know, 300, 500 years ago, something like that, if you want to be super technical, but sequential art was around telling stories. So that's a whole other thing, though. That's a really deep topic that I haven't looked into since I was in college myself. But then, yeah, the second thing is, in terms of Japanese entertainment, in America, we have this concept of, like, selling out or being inauthentic. We highly value authenticity from our artists, even if that's often an illusion. In Japan, in terms of their music industry and their film industry, that's basically not even an attempt is made to be authentic. They are. I have heard the term industry plant in music for somebody who was just put there by the recording studios because they look good and sound good. Japan's explicit about that. They have contests. They have all this stuff. So
the singer-songwriter in Japan is an outlier.
You're not going to get, to Kermit's point, you don't get a Bob Dylan singing protest songs in Japan on the radio. He's not represented by the right agency.
Yeah.
But again, art, you don't need the resources of these big agencies. The comics, you don't need all this stuff. You just need some guy who can Xerox your pictures. So that provides an avenue that the counterculture can use in general. And I think that's part of why you see the anime and manga industry go push these boundaries in terms of sex and violence. And I don't want to turn anybody off of anime and manga in terms of that, but you can definitely find some, there's no other way to say it, fucked up shit.
I mean, it's in the same way that you can find it in Western media.
To an extent, I think there's a lot more.
Yeah.
It can sometimes be more accessible and or disguised.
Anything can be anywhere.
Like manga.
There's just more of it here.
Paradoxical in the sense that like we don't censor genitalia necessarily in pornography.
Yeah.
But they make up for that
in other ways.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't like those ways. A lot of the times I don't like what they do with that.
Most of the time, you're not just going to run
and I'm not saying that's all or even a lot or most. It's not a huge part of the culture. It's just that's where the boundaries get pushed for us. If you think of a song like WAP, there's a manga like WAP.
I mean, if you're into it, you can find it. So that said,
yeah,
another one of Kermit's friends, Paige, she says, she says, I would also be interested in historical background information, as we've just gone over, but also the impact anime has had on our culture, specifically Western culture.
I'd say in terms of art, movies, probably even music,
it's touched everything.
Yeah. It's a huge feedback loop. Comic books now employ a ton of Japanese artists, Korean artists, and the thing that often gets overlooked when we have these conversations, I talked about this a little bit when I was reviewing Matt Alt's book, is like you can't underestimate the impact Japan had on Korea and China as well. And we might talk about this a little bit in the definitions, but Korea and China have been getting anime and manga longer than we have, and it has had a huge impact on their comic scene. Korean webcomics look like anime, but they've kind of developed their own feel.
Yeah.
And that's happened a lot in American comics as well. There have been numerous intentional crossovers as well. There is a Marvel manga universe. There's a lot of that.
Which actually, some people might not know, actually started a long time ago.
Yeah.
I want to say 70s or 80s.
Japan has a glorious live-action Spider-Man.
I mean, what?
Glorious is not the word I would
Sentai
use.
from, I know that's another definitional thing, but isn't Sentai, which would be if you know Power Rangers, isn't that born out of Japan getting Spider-Man and going, what's this? And then years later you get Kamen Rider and you get, like I said, you get what we know about in the West, which is Power Rangers. Like that's born of Spider-Man.
That's probably the most Ouroboros of the whole thing.
Yeah. But even Astro Boy comes from Disney. The Astro Boy animation was explicitly put up against Popeye and the Flintstones and Hanna-Barbera cartoons. It is a huge feedback loop. I think Japan, it might surprise people to know, has a music industry second only to the United States in terms of sales. You would think it might be Korea with K-pop.
They're probably third, aren't they?
Yeah, they're up there. But
J-pop
is Japanese people consume so much J-pop. I forget why I was talking about the Japanese music industry.
Because it's big.
I think I was talking about it because
how it's influenced our own culture.
The phrase "big in Japan."
Yeah,
there's a reason for that. There's a ton of money to be made in music in Japan, so even the musical influence circles back eventually.
Right.
And that's, if you really, really want to know about this, I will say Pure Imagination by Matt Alt is a good book to check out.
And also make sure to subscribe to our podcast because we're going to have Matt Alt on in a couple months.
Ooh.
But yeah, that was a really cool book. It looks at modern, I'd say like 20th century to 21st century Japanese history from the perspective of Japan's exports, which is how most of us have engaged with Japan, whether we know it or not. And that would probably be like the best answer to your question, because I'm just going to regurgitate his points.
Yeah, I mean, and even through all that stuff, to put in my little 2 cents, a lot of shows that you probably watched growing up, cartoons from the West, were literally animated by Japanese and Korean
Oh,
studio.
yeah. I mean-
Things like The Simpsons, which
Yeah.
you would think like that's American, is it? Like the keyframes might be, and the stories are like a lot of the like Cartoon Network stuff, like that's being animated, hand drawn
Going back,
in Japan and Korea. Like
Yeah.
it's the even if they're not in charge of these shows, these quote unquote American Canadian shows, they're drawing their animation influence, their anime influence is present, even if you can't see it.
it's funny if you go back and watch like the first 7 seasons of The Simpsons and realize how many jokes about Japan were there and how many of them involved anime and like the Japanese language. Like the creators of The Simpsons were well aware of the Japanese culture, and they were making jokes that I don't, on one level it works because it's just weird and foreign. But when I was watching it as a kid, that's what I thought, like, haha, that's obviously a foreigner. But then when you watch it as an adult, you're like, that's fucking anime.
Yeah, they knew. Everybody knew earlier, regardless of the thing, everybody knew earlier than you think they did.
Yeah.
People in the West knew earlier than you think they did. People in Japan. What, freaking the Super Mario Brothers music is based on some like crazy jazz album nobody's heard.
Mario is going to come back here in a minute. But to finish off Paige's question,
Yeah.
she is wondering about the fight between subs and dubs.
That we had an episode on that.
So,
That's too big.
yeah, I
But
wanna
I guess
say
we should define those unless that's in the vocab section.
No, we will. I'll talk about that here. So first of all, we did do an entire episode on it. Once you
probably
get
do
through
another
this
one.
episode, you can probably go listen to that and actually understand what we're talking about.
Hopefully.
So go check that out. To set a level on here, sub would be subtitled and dub would be dubbed, as in
Dub title.
the audio has changed. So a subtitle in an anime is you're listening to the audio in the original Japanese and you have subtitles at the bottom. Fairly self-explanatory. Dubs would be
Like any
when-
foreign film or
Yeah.
media.
Dubs would be when they get new voice actors to redo it in the language, English in this case.
This is a situation not exclusive to anime, but it is, I feel like, talked about the most readily online because you don't grow up with most other media from different languages being aware of that.
Right.
With,
And-
with anime, you generally, especially now in the internet, you are.
I think most people who have experienced anime tangentially in Western media settings, like on television, are going to be familiar with dubs because that's how they do it for TV.
Television. I believe Toonami back in the day
Right.
on Cartoon Network, which may or may not be running. I haven't had cable in years.
Whereas on a lot of streaming services, like a lot of times they tend to default to the original Japanese audio with subtitles. That's here nor there for the most part because you can switch, you can turn the subtitles
It's a lot
off and-
easier now. There's not as much of a war because you have your choice is a lot
Right.
more.
But I want to
I was gonna say, I'll if you're going to, I'll throw in my 2 cents real quick on which I prefer.
So what I want to say is for anyone who's just first getting into this, just watch the dub.
disagree.
Watch what speaks to you.
Right.
Try the original. If
Here's-
that doesn't work for you, go for the dub.
Here's the thing. The sub, if you are able to read the subtitles without getting too distracted by it, I've talked to some people, they can't really do subtitles. Just watch the dub. You're going to get most of it from the dub. Now, to, I think, Ben's point here, I'll let him talk in a second. The subtitle version is generally going to be better if you can do the subtitles, because a lot of the times the dubs, they don't have a whole lot of time to do the recording, and so you're not going to get quite the level of emotion and everything that you'll get from the original Japanese voice actors.
Or consistency, or the
Right.
characters come across properly because there's just not as much time and money and direction and localization available for the situation.
That's basically what I would say.
Yeah.
It in all honesty, if you can stomach the subs, if you can read them, and give yourself, if you've never watched a foreign film, give yourself a couple minutes to get used to it, looking
Yeah.
at the picture and reading the subtitles. If you can pull it off, Subbed is the way to go.
I would say, as someone who basically exclusively watches subtitled anime, after you're in it for a while, reading the subtitles sort of becomes automatic. You sort of don't even notice that you're doing it anymore.
I understand. I mean, my wife is dyslexic. I understand certain people can't keep up with it. It's just, and especially in certain scenes when the contrast isn't enough, I get it.
If they're talking too fast and it moves too fast.
Yeah. If it's uncomfortable to watch it subtitled, if you're missing too much information, go ahead and watch it dubbed. I would just say, like, if you've ever watched an old Godzilla movie dubbed, like, the dub's very wildly in quality from, like, almost as good to better than the original to Godzilla movie terrible.
And we'll be talking about a couple series in our recommendation section that we will specifically touch on dubs versus subs for that, because there are some, there's a few out there that the dub is legitimately really good.
Yeah.
And those ones probably should watch the dub instead of the sub. But those are few and far between. But to reiterate, you can watch the dub. It's not a big deal, especially if you don't talk to anime nerds, because then, nobody's going to shame you for that.
That might even be one point in favor of the dub, is it will alienate you from anime nerds.
Oh, yeah. So our last question for this segment, for our first segment here, which we need to wrap up, is from someone else that we all know and love, Jim. So Jim says, why is anime better than American productions? To which I will say,
it's not.
It's not.
Yeah, it's just different.
It's just different.
It's
or the same.
I'll say, like, they don't always compete directly. Like, there is no American Akira.
Yeah.
There's no American Perfect Blue. There's just certain things that American animation, certain topics and tones it hasn't tried to tackle.
I also will say, something just dawned on me thinking about it, because this has now been showing up more recently in Western animation, especially now with the age of streaming, but just also somewhat before it. And the things that did it before then, we had a term we used earlier that I'm trying to make in vogue. Anime in general was sequential. It had a canon. An episode preceded another one, and another one followed it, and the story flowed through all of them. Especially, I can speak as somebody who grew up in the 90s, American cartoons, by and large, didn't do that.
Episodic.
Is that the word for it? I always thought episodic was the one where there was a continuing story, but I don't know that. It always sounded wrong when you said that, but I wasn't ever sure 100%. But basically, like, you had Dexter's Laboratory. Each one was kind of its own little thing.
Yeah.
The world reset back, whatever happened. There wasn't any episode you had to see before you saw the next one. But anime wasn't like that. It was, and I think that's why a lot of people latched on it. And I guess, again, I can only speak to my time growing up. It's like, when you have Pokemon, I have to tape that every Saturday morning when I'm going to soccer practice, because if I miss what happens and I try to get to it next week and Ash has some crazy new Pokemon I've never seen before, I have missed something. And while it's harder to keep up with, and it's much easier to keep up with in streaming platform we live in now, I think that's one of the major things that made it stand out to us as different in the West. And now that's not as special anymore, but I think that has been deep-seated enough, it has been sitting around long enough that it has taken that momentum and gone with it from there.
Yeah. So Jim goes on to ask, what's the first movie or show you should watch to get started? And I think we'll save that for later.
The recommendation section we keep talking about.
So pay attention. Are there popular recurring hero characters? Who is the Luke Skywalker or Mario of anime?
Jim?
I actually walked over to Jim and said, Jim, Mario is the Mario of anime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That goes back to you've watched it without even knowing it.
That's an interesting question.
Mario dub or Mario sub?
It's an interesting question beyond that, though, because sort of anime and manga don't really have that to that degree.
No, they do. It's tropes. It's archetypes and tropes. Anime is full of archetypes, like all media is full of archetypes.
But there isn't
They're just different.
a recurring character that will show up in multiple.
Well, Luke Skywalker
I think he means it's an
doesn't-
archetype. It's not like Luke Skywalker doesn't show up more than in Star Wars, but there are characters like Luke Skywalker, like Princess Leia, like Han Solo. They are character archetypes. Every culture and series of media has archetypes. Anime has archetypes. They have their own archetypes, but they have them. They have reoccurring, like, here is dumb guy who eats meat who likes to fight. Is a reoccurring trope.
Yeah, there's definitely
Goku,
tropes, but
see Luffy, see Naruto, see other ones that I can't think of right now. Like, there are definitely reoccurring archetypes and things.
I mean, his question specifically is reoccurring hero characters. So I think that's more
I
towards
still
like
read that
Luke
as-
Skywalker is in, five movies or
I
whatever.
don't think that's what he means.
I'm going to go with a combination here. Is both archetype and in terms of like wildly popular character. In a lot of action anime, there is what I would call like the Wukong stereotype. Wukong is the Monkey King. He's a character in Journey to the West, which is a famous Chinese like fairy tale or folk tale.
Legend.
Yeah, and the Monkey King is basically a comedic relief kind of character who is really good at martial arts, really obsessed with martial arts, but he's kind of a dumb but well-meaning dude. And so
Except for that one time.
the dumb but well-meaning dude archetype is the protagonist of a lot of action stuff, and probably the most popular anime and manga by far of the last 20 years is One Piece. And in One Piece, that character would be Monkey D. Luffy.
Yeah, I mean,
literally
it's
has
literally
monkey in the name.
Yeah. And
But also, and I think this is probably someone who fits the recurring hero character, would be Goku in Dragon Ball.
yeah, again,
He's one
which
of
is
the only ones that-
literally the same.
It's still the same author for the most part, but like that's multiple series. that
Goku's
he's
appeared in. It's questionable how much Toriyama
Yeah.
writes, but Goku is literally Wukong, just the Japanese pronunciation of those characters.
But you touched on it earlier where it's like the author themselves have a lot of control over their characters, whereas in the West that doesn't happen so much. And so you'll see it a lot more in the West where Spider-Man will show up in multiple different series of other heroes and his own series.
Yeah.
And that really doesn't happen that much.
There's not really crossovers because
Yeah.
unless they're just like a fun little moment that usually doesn't count. It's
You're all
not
in
like,
Shonen Jump, but Shonen Jump isn't a shared universe.
There's a
Correct.
Isekai Quartet, but that's like
Brad,
such
that's
an
inside
outlier.
baseball.
Yeah. But that
Isekai
one
is
that,
inside baseball.
Well,
Yes.
that show has 5 or 6 different
And that's
shows sort of
and it's
mashed
specifically
together,
its individual gimmick.
but
They don't-
I mean, and
these
that
characters
that
don't
came out
generally cross over.
that came out and people were like, "Whoa, this is so interesting and
Yeah.
different," because like
We don't see
it
it.
doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Jim goes on to ask, "Are there typical story arcs, and how are they different than American stories?"
Christ, yes.
Oh my gosh, yes. We don't have enough time to talk about this. So just
Tropes?
The short answer is yes. The
Yeah.
long answer is yes.
I would
We don't
say
have time.
The short answer is tournament arc.
Yes.
Moving on.
Moving on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There's
for the
definitely
shortness.
there's actually not a lot of different tropes. There's a couple different tropes, and they use them a lot.
Yeah.
There are many. There are as many as we have, which is to say a lot. In a lot of different shapes and forms. You're thinking about just shonen stuff.
Different from American stories. I mean,
Yes.
the popular tropes, the ones that are popular are different from like Western popular tropes, but there's a lot of overlap.
This is where the circular influence is going to hit. I would say one of the things that attracted me the most to manga versus comics, we've talked about this before, is probably cultivation versus given power.
Yeah.
Spider-Man is bit by a radioactive spider and he becomes super strong. In a Japanese story that is similar, Spider-Man might have some initial power, but then he trains to make it stronger. The training to build your strength is a very, not just Japanese, but Eastern theme.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what clicks for a lot of people, is the earned power.
I feel like a combination of that and that because these are sometimes long-running series going by chapter, you can follow these characters with the same voice over a large amount of time. And there is a certain thing of like, hey, this week we're going on an adventure and we're going to be doing that for a while, but then we're just kind of chill for a while because that's just what the story is doing. And then we're going to go do this over here. Like, there's a certain amount of just, you're spending time with the characters and they're doing this and they're doing that, but there's always that sense of these are the characters that they were before and however they've changed and wherever they're going. There's that constant feeling of history and movement into the future.
Yeah. Jim also asks, why does there seem to be a correlation between gamers and people who like anime?
I feel like this is its own episode. That might be its own episode.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that
why
might
is
be.
anime cringe and why we don't like people who like it except us and the people we like?
Yeah, I would say the short answer is probably just fantasy.
Yeah. Fantasy nerd stuff. It's just
Yeah.
kind of all.
And there's, there's a level of escapism in there.
Yes.
Power fantasy, that
Yep.
kind of thing.
And there is a level, and this is something we're going to talk about on a future episode already. There is a connection between Japan being the land of the video games for so long and anime.
Yep.
Because a lot of your favorite video games probably do have anime concept art or something similar to it.
Brad, put this on the Google Doc.
I think there's something also to be said there about like hyper reality, or rather the departure from reality, where video games, anime, manga tend to not care so much about depicting reality. Even a lot of the realistic video games, air quotes,
Or realistic manga.
have these fantastical elements in it. You might
You can be playing Call of Duty, but you still have a health bar.
right, or you get shot multiple times and your vision turns red, but then you're fine.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of is a connection point there. It's and that goes back to the sort of the escapism thing. It's like, yeah, you're sitting at home, and you just got home from your hard day at work and it was no fun and everything, and like now I'm gonna do something that lets me not live in this reality for a little while.
And yeah, not to keep building, but one thing that made me think of is a lot of video games, like I'm thinking of like Elden Ring, which is a Japanese game.
made.
But like those boss fights, very much like an anime boss fight. There's like timings, set attacks, moves, all that stuff.
There's probably an organ playing.
Yeah, and so
Next form.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
My final
So
form.
anime and video games really synergize on some of the action elements.
So the last part of Jim's question is going to lead us directly into our next section.
Hooray.
Jim asks, what are the typical subgenres?
My God, there's so many.
ブランのスポンサーでお送りします。
Are you a fan of Japanese snacks and treats?
I sure am.
Well, then you'll love Sugoi Mart. They offer a wide variety of popular Japanese snacks, candy, drinks, and more,
Like Kit Kats.
all delivered right to your door.
Different flavored Kit Kats.
But for our listeners today, if you've got no clue about Japanese snacks, candy, drinks, and more, then Sugoi Mart has you covered anyway. I was checking them out recently, and I saw that they have an experiences section, which is pretty cool. They have they're almost sort of box sets that sort of cover different sort of staples of Japanese eating culture, if you will.
Taste the roppongi.
They have an onigiri box, which people will probably know as rice cakes.
Donuts.
It's rice cakes.
Jelly donuts. Curious, rice balls.
Rice
cakes
balls,
are something
that would be the
different.
one.
I'm really curious how that works in a box that is mailed to your home.
So they send you the rice, and they send you the seaweed, and they send you, I think, some mayo and some other stuff, and you put it together.
Okay, I wasn't sure how well that would ship in a box, so I guess they've solved that problem.
You have to make the rice yourself. They also have a matcha box, which,
Gross.
if people aren't familiar, matcha is basically green tea, but it's generally powdered.
It shows up a lot in their snacks.
And
You can get it at Starbucks.
with matcha, you either like it or you hate it. So,
Truth.
and they also have a bento experience box.
Bento, right? Ben gets shipped to my house in a box. What's that?
A bento is basically a lunchbox, a boxed lunch. In fact, there's a store
Called
Boxed Lunch that I hate because why didn't they just call it bento?
I love that store because they sell pop culture stuff that doesn't look like a hideous thing like you buy in any other store that sells pop culture stuff.
But if you want to try those out, the listeners of our podcast can get 15% off their first purchase if you either use the link in the description or use the code APR15 at checkout.
安いですね.
So just head to segoymart.com and shop their selection of delicious Japanese snacks today.
Remember, anime, podcaster, reincarnation, 15.
APR 15.
すごいだ.
So you may be wondering to yourself right now, they said there's more to cover, but this episode's almost over. And you'd be right. But we didn't want to scare anyone away with a 3-hour episode, so here we are at the end of part 1 of The Beginner's Guide to Anime and Manga. Part 2 will come out next week, so get subscribed so you don't miss it. In the meantime, you can find more from us on our website, animepodcasterreincarnation.com, as well as links to all of our social media. So reach out and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening, and until next week, I hope the start of your journey into anime and manga has been fun.
Brad's very like monocolor outfit right now.
He matches literally, Brad matches the drapes now.
The pillowcase. I did not do this on purpose, but can you tell I like the color sage?
Sage.
My wife, she like always wears black and I make fun of her for it. And then one day she wasn't wearing all black and she's like, I'm not wearing all black. I was like, no, you're somehow wearing all red. She got like
It's
a red
all one color.
Yeah, a red t-shirt and red shorts. And I'm like,
why? How?
yeah, this proves something about your mental health. I'm not sure what,
But no, in Full Metal Alchemist, I feel like the one thing everybody remembers that they make meme about and react to solidly is the doctor combining his daughter and the dog. And it's tired now. I'm bored of it. It's boring. If you bring that up and you act like you're edgy, you are boring. You bore me. You're lame. It's done. It's been done for decades. It's been done to death. Like, you got to really bring your A game to it, you know? And I'm not saying the original bit was bad. I'm just saying, like, it's overplayed and it's weird. That's like the one free range meme from Full Metal Alchemist. Because if everybody loves it so much, there should be more, right? I should see Armstrong on my feeds and timelines on the daily, and I don't. And that's a travesty.
no, it's definitely one of those that people picked up the meme and have never seen the show.
Yeah. Also, it's early enough that you don't need to watch a lot of it to experience it. And if you are like Waka Waka, the thing we're going to be talking about today, I'm sure it would shock you real big if that was one of your first anime experiences. Brad, that's cringe.
Kimo.
Kimo. What did that one mean again? Like,
Cringe.
Like literally?
Kimochi warui. Kimochi means feel and warui means bad. So whenever they want to say somebody's creeping them out or something, they say kimochi warui. You make me
They
feel.
just go Kimo.
Kimo,
You kind of know.
they always translate it now as cringe.
Yeah.
Whenever a character says kimo. If you're ever watching Japanese pornography, then
They say cringe a lot.
no, a girl will shout just kimochi, meaning feels good.
I don't remember that's what you told us it meant, Ben.
I don't know that I needed to know that.
We talked about this.
Yamate means something else.
Save this until September when we do the cursed horny episode to make it extra cursed. That means hello. You should listen to Ben.
That means hello, but only in the afternoon.
It's evening now, so
Konbanwa.
there you go. That one fits you better.
Con Benoit.
Konbanwa.
The topic I really want to get into, which is, I don't know if it'll go in recommendations or not, is that concept of, like, are you suggesting this to somebody who's already, like, into cartoons and comics or video games, or, like, the two people who asked where to start are, like, older people in my life who are, like, I don't know what I would like. It's not just like, oh yeah, go watch Demon Slayer. That's a good getting on point. It's like, I'm embarrassed to talk to you about anime, even if you are interested, because I don't want to. It's the please don't. Yeah,
I would
so
say
I have
that's recommendations.
question.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have her question under questions, so
Yeah.
we can cover it then.
exactly. But it's that concept of like, there are certain people where it's just like, you don't give me the vibe you'd be into this, and you might be, but it's like, what am I going to like? What you suggest to that person is different than just like, oh, it's my buddy. He plays video games. He just has an experience that said he'd be into it, and not like, this is my brother-in-law's older mother who I love dearly, who's asking this question. It's like, what would I suggest to her that wasn't the most embarrassing thing? That there might be a chance that she'd like get and appreciate, because like she's it's not like she's like freaking, my mom is not culturally sharp or smart, and I would never suggest, but it's like my brother-in-law's mom is like, she's smart, she's creative, she's into things, and it's just like, yeah, please don't watch any of the normal long-running ones. It'd be embarrassing to me, but please watch this, you know? But I don't know where we put that conversation.
J-pop is... Japanese people consume so much J-pop that... if that's in there. Alexa, play Kickback. Cover my mistakes.